The day started like any other, quiet and uneventful. The sun filtered through the blinds, casting stripes of light across the living room floor where Max, my golden retriever, stretched out in lazy comfort. He was the heart of my home, a companion who never asked for much beyond food, walks, and affection. For years, Max had lived in the neighborhood without incidents, loved by neighbors who often stopped to pet him when I walked him around the block. But that morning, everything changed, with a single piece of paper taped to my front door. It wasn't just any notice, it was an official letter from the Homeowners Association. The logo, bold and imposing, sat at the top of the page, followed by words that made my stomach drop. Notice of fine, $300 for repeated disturbances due to excessive dog barking. I stood frozen on the porch, the paper crinkling in my hand as I read it again and again. The accusation felt absurd. Max barked. Sure, he was a dog, but never to the point of disturbance. He barked when the mailman arrived or when the occasional squirrel darted across the lawn. Yet somehow, the HOA had decided this behavior warranted a fine larger than some people's monthly utility bills. The letter went on to explain that complaints had been filed against me by multiple neighbors. Each complaint, it said, had been documented, and the board had deemed the noise excessive. The fine was due within 30 days, and failure to pay could result in further action, including legal proceedings or even a lien placed on my property. Anger welled up inside me. This wasn't about noise, it was about control. The HOA had been increasingly aggressive in recent years, sending out fines and warnings for the most trivial things. A trash can left visible for too long, a garden gnome deemed unsightly, or grass that grew a fraction of an inch too tall. But this was personal. As I stepped back inside, Max looked up at me with his usual trusting eyes, his tail thumping softly against the floor. It was impossible to imagine him as some kind of menace. It was hintly playful, and while Devine wasn't hoosed on fire, it was a direct attack on both of us. I began to replay recent days in my mind, searching for moments when Max's barking could have caused real trouble. Nothing stood out. The neighborhood itself wasn't exactly quiet. There were kids playing basketball late into the evening, car alarms occasionally blaring, and even the hum of lawn equipment every weekend. No one seemed to mind those noises, but somehow, Max's bark had been singled out. The more I thought about it, the more I began to suspect there was something else at play. Perhaps a member of the HOA board had a personal grudge. Maybe it was the new couple across the street, the ones who had moved in only months ago and seemed to complain about everything. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the letter spread out before me, the words taunting me with every glance. I knew I had 3 choices. I could pay the fine and swallow the injustice, I could appeal the decision through the HOAS process, or I could fight back in a way that would make them regret ever targeting me. The first option was out of the question. I wasn't going to hand over $300 for something Max didn't even do wrong. The second option, appealing, was laughable. Everyone in the neighborhood knew how those appeals went. The board acted as judge, jury, and executioner, almost never overturning a decision they had made. That left the third option, fight back. I began with research. I pulled out my laptop and started digging into HOA regulations, both in my community and in the state. I learned quickly that while HOAs had authority, they were also bound by certain laws and restrictions. They couldn't fine arbitrarily. They had to provide proof, follow due process, and give residents the opportunity to respond. The letter I received was vague, offering no specific times or dates when Max's barking was supposedly disruptive. That detail alone could be a violation of procedure. Still, I knew that fighting within their system might not be enough. They thrived on bureaucracy, on dragging things out until people gave up. What the HOA feared most wasn't paperwork or resistance behind closed doors. It was exposure. HOAs operated in the shadows, relying on residents' silence and compliance. If their actions were dragged into the light, if people outside the neighborhood saw the pettiness and abuse of power, the board's authority could crumble. That's when the idea hit me. I would go online. The internet was a powerful equalizer. Platforms were filled with stories of people exposing their HOAs, and those stories spread like wildfire. I realized I didn't just want to win my case. I wanted to show the world what was happening here. The thought of turning the HOAS fine into a viral story gave me a new sense of energy. The next morning, I set up cameras, one by the front door, another in the backyard, and one inside facing the living room, where Max usually stayed during the day. If they wanted to accuse my dog of constant barking, I would collect evidence proving otherwise. At the same time, I began drafting a post that would detail everything: the fine, the lack of proof, the absurdity of the accusation, and the history of the HOAS bullying. The battle wasn't just about $300 anymore. It was about standing up to a system that thrived on intimidation. Max, lying at my feet as I typed, seemed to sense the shift. And so, with one notice slipped under my door, the HOA had made a critical mistake. The first day after receiving the fine was spent in a haze of determination. I knew if I wanted to fight the HOA effectively, I needed more than anger and suspicion. I needed undeniable proof. The cameras I had installed around my property were the start of that plan. Their blinking red lights reassured me that every sound and movement would be captured. Every moment Max spent indoors or outdoors carefully logged. Max himself seemed blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding around him. He lounged on the sofa, played fetch in the yard, and slept soundly at night. His barking remained as ordinary as ever, short bursts at passing cars or squirrels, nothing remotely resembling the excessive disturbances described in the HOAS notice. Already, the recordings began to work in my favor. I spent hours reviewing footage, eyes fixed on the screen as the days ticked by. What I saw confirmed my instincts. Max's barking was sporadic, brief, and no louder than any other normal neighborhood noise. In fact, more often than not, the loudest sounds came not from Max, but from lawnmowers, kids' basketball games, and even the HOA president's own leaf blower roaring every Saturday morning. As I compiled clips, I started building a timeline. Every bark was logged with exact times, and every silence stretched out longer than the accusations implied. By the end of the week, I had a clear record that proved Max wasn't the menace they painted him to be. But I didn't stop there. I walked the neighborhood, casually speaking to people I trusted. Most of them rolled their eyes when I mentioned the fine, admitting the HOA had grown increasingly unreasonable. A few even offered to give statements if I needed them. It became clear that the multiple complaints mentioned in the notice might not have come from multiple neighbors at all, but perhaps just one or two persistent While I gathered my evidence, I began crafting my online strategy. I drafted a post exposing the HOAS behavior, careful to keep it factual and professional. I wasn't going to rely on raw emotion alone. I wanted readers to see the absurdity for themselves. I scanned the letter, highlighted its vague wording, and attached clips of Max calmly lounging or barking only briefly at ordinary triggers. My draft explained the broader issue too: how HOAs often abuse their power to intimidate residents into compliance. When the post was ready, I hesitated for a moment. Once I clicked publish, there would be no going back. The story would spread, and the HOA would know I wasn't going to quietly accept their punishment. Taking a deep breath, I hit the button. The response was immediate. Comments began flooding in within hours, people outraged on my behalf, sharing similar stories of petty fines and harassment from their own HOA. Strangers from across the country sympathized with Max, calling him innocent and adorable, and criticizing the HOA for targeting me. By the next morning, the post had gone viral. Thousands of shares, screenshots spreading across platforms, even small blogs and local news aggregators picking up the story. That was when the HOA realized they were in trouble. 2 days after my post gained traction, another letter arrived. This one wasn't taped to my turret, was delivered by certified mail, an attempt to make it seem more formal and intimidating. The language was harsher, warning me about defamation and misrepresentation of the board. They demanded I take down the post immediately, or face further consequences. But the damage was already done. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a symbol. Removing it wouldn't erase the thousands of people who had already seen it. In fact, the HOAS threats only fueled the fire, with commenters mocking their attempt to silence me. The more they pushed, the worse they looked. At night, I sat at my kitchen table, rereading their letters, comparing them to state statutes I had researched. Their threats of defamation were hollow. I hadn't lied. Every word I posted was backed by evidence, and legally, truth was a defense. Still, the pressure weighed on me. I knew HOAs could be relentless, dragging homeowners into court, peeling on fees, and making lives miserable until people gave up or moved out. But for the first time, I felt I had leverage. The power dynamic had shifted. They weren't the faceless authority, Mori was the one with the spotlight, and they were scrambling to contain the fallout. One evening, as I scrolled through the latest wave of supportive comments online, Max climbed into my lap, tail wagging, tongue lolling in that goofy grin he always wore. It struck me then how absurd the situation really was. This dog, who brought nothing but comfort and joy to my life, was at the center of a battle that had spiraled far beyond a $300 fine. The HOA thought they could intimidate me with bureaucracy, but now, the world was watching. Their pettiness had become their undoing, and as more neighbors began quietly reaching out, emboldened by my stand, I realized this wasn't just my fight anymore, was the start of something bigger. The board had poked the wrong homeowner, and their attempt to silence me had only made my voice louder. But even as I celebrated the small victories, I knew this was only the beginning. HOAs rarely back down quietly. Their next move was coming, and I had to be ready. The HOA didn't waste time licking their wounds. Within days of my post going viral, they escalated the retaliation in a way that made it clear they weren't going to let me walk away unchallenged. A thick envelope arrived by certified mail, its weight alone enough to make my pulse quicken. Inside was a notice of hearing, a formal summons to appear before the board. The accusations had multiplied. Not only was I being fined for Max's barking, but now they alleged I had violated community standards by defaming the association and failing to maintain respectful relations with neighbors. It was surreal to read. They were twisting my refusal to stay silent into a crime against the neighborhood itself. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and failure to attend, the letter warned, could result in further legal consequences, including liens and foreclosure proceedings. I set the papers down and stared out the window, watching Max chase a butterfly in the yard, his fur glowing in the afternoon sun. He had no idea the storm brewing around him, no clue that his simple barks had triggered an all-out war. But I knew one thing. If I gave in now, they'd only grow bolder. I doubled down on my preparations. I compiled every video recording I had collected, cross-referencing timestamps with their accusations. I gathered written statements from neighbors who confirmed Max was never disruptive, and I printed out the HOA's own bylaws, highlighting sections that required them to provide specific, documented evidence before issuing fines. They hadn't done that. Their notices were vague, their claims unsubstantiated. Meanwhile, online support continued to swell. My story had caught the attention of larger platforms. Local journalists reached out, curious to interview me. Pet owners in particular rallied behind me, sharing my posts and encouraging me to stand strong. Some even donated to a small online fund someone had set up on my behalf, just in case the HOA tried to bury me in legal fees. What had started as a fight over a barking dog was quickly becoming a movement against HOA abuse of power. The hearing day arrived sooner than I expected. I walked into the association's meeting room with my binder of evidence under one arm and a quiet determination in my chest. The board members sat behind a long table, their faces tight and severe. They looked less like neighbors and more like prosecutors preparing to deliver a sentence. The room was tense. A few other residents sat in the back, curious or perhaps supportive, though none spoke. The president began reading the charges in a clipped, rehearsed tone, as though the outcome was already decided. They accused me of fostering hostility in the community, of spreading falsehoods online, and of undermining the integrity of the association. Each word felt heavier, designed to intimidate and isolate. But I had come prepared. When they asked for my response, I opened my binder and began laying out the evidence. Videos showing Max calm and quiet for hours on end. Logs proving his barks were brief and infrequent. Letters from neighbors confirming the same. And then, I held up their original notice, pointing out its lack of specific times, dates, or even complainants. I reminded them of the bylaws they themselves had written, bylaws they had failed to follow. Their faces shifted as I spoke. Some grew defensive, others onyasi. For the first time, cracks appeared in their united front. The more evidence I presented, the more obvious it became that their accusations weren't rooted in fact, but in retaliation. But I didn't stop there. Before leaving, I reminded them that the world was watching. My story was already public. Thousands of people knew what they had done, and every action they took from here on out would only shine a brighter spotlight on their behavior. That last point hit harder than anything else, I said. For all their threats and formality, the board thrived on silence. Exposure was their greatest fear. The hearing ended without a resolution. They said they would deliberate and send me their decision in writing. But as I walked out of the room, I felt a quiet confidence growing inside me. They were cornered. Later that evening, I updated my online followers, detailing the hearing and sharing clips of my evidence. The reaction was explosive. Comments poured in, mocking the HOA, praising my preparation, and demanding accountability. Some even began digging into the board members themselves, uncovering inconsistencies and questionable behavior. The HOA had tried to intimidate me into silence, but instead, they had turned me into a symbol. Yet beneath the triumph, I remained cautious. HOAs rarely admitted defeat, and desperation often led to reckless decisions. I knew this fight wasn't over. If anything, it was about to escalate into something even bigger. And as Max curled up beside me that night, I wondered just how far the board was willing to go to protect their power. The board didn't take long to reveal their next move. If the hearing had rattled them, they decided to strike back, not with evidence, but with manipulation. A few days after the tense meeting, new flyers began circulating around the neighborhood. They were slipped under doors, pinned to bulletin boards, even taped to mailboxes. The flyers painted me as a troublemaker. In bold letters, they accused me of endangering community harmony, of spreading lies about dedicated volunteers, and of placing personal interests above the well-being of neighbors. My name was listed, alongside vague accusations of harassment and misconduct. At the bottom, in smaller print, was a reminder: this homeowner remains in violation and has yet to comply with association regulations. Reading it, my stomach turned. They were trying to isolate me, to turn the neighborhood against me. The board wasn't just fighting me directly anymore, they wanted to destroy my reputation. But the move backfired almost immediately. Neighbors who had quietly supported me before now stepped into the open, disgusted by the smear tactics. A retired couple 2 houses down knocked on my door to let me know they had thrown their flyers straight into the trash. A single mother down the block texted me a photo of hers with the caption, "Don't let them bully you. We're with you." The online world reacted even more fiercely. Once I shared the flyer in my next post, the outrage was deafening. People ridiculed the HOA's attempt to intimidate me through character assassination. They pointed out the irony of an association claiming to maintain harmony while distributing propaganda against one of its own residents. Memes started circulating, mocking the board's language, and hashtags like #JusticeForMax began trending in local circles. The more they tried to silence me, the louder my story became. Still, the board pressed forward. They tacked on additional fines, each more ludicrous than the last. One notice accused me of having an improperly stored trash bin because it had been visible for an hour longer than regulation allowed. Another fined me for failure to maintain lawn uniformity, even though my grass was neatly trimmed. Each fine felt like a transparent attempt to bury me under paperwork and debt. But I had learned to document everything. I photographed my yard, time-stamped my trash bins, and saved every letter. I turned their harassment into evidence, uploading the absurd charges for the world to see. Each new fine became another example of how far the HOA was willing to go in its vendetta, and each upload only added fuel to the fire of public opinion. Meanwhile, allies I hadn't expected began to emerge. A local journalist who specialized in consumer rights reached out, asking if I'd be willing to do an interview. They wanted to cover not just my case but the broader issue of HOA abuse across the state. I agreed, and within days, my story appeared in a widely read online publication. The headline was damning: "Homeowners Fight Back Against Predatory HOA Practices." The article was shared widely, and suddenly, my little battle with the board wasn't just neighborhood gossip, it was news. Politicians, advocacy groups, and even lawyers began commenting publicly, condemning the association's behavior. Some neighbors who had previously stayed silent now came forward, emboldened by the growing attention. They shared their own stories of being fined or threatened, building a chorus of dissent that the board could no longer ignore. And yet, despite the walls closing in on them, the board didn't relent. Instead, they doubled down, calling an emergency meeting where they announced new community standards that gave them even more authority to issue fines for disruptive conduct. It was a transparent power grab, rushed through in the hope of regaining control before the backlash consumed them. But by then, the damage was done. Their reputation was in tatters, their authority unraveling with each passing day. Where once their notices had inspired fear, now they inspired ridicule. Neighbors rolled their eyes, crumpled their letters, and laughed at the absurdity. The aura of power the board had carefully cultivated for years was evaporating. At night, I sat in my living room scrolling through the latest wave of support, Max's head resting on my lap. What had started as a $300 fine had grown into something far larger, a community awakening. A movement against intimidation. I had gone from feeling isolated and powerless to standing at the center of a storm I had helped create. But beneath the victories, I knew one thing for certain. Desperate people make desperate moves. And as much as the HOA was flailing now, I had the sinking feeling their final act was yet to come. The HOA's desperation finally boiled over into the most aggressive move yet, a lawsuit. One crisp morning, I found a knock at my door and was handed a thick stack of legal documents. The cover page, stamped with the county seal, declared it plainly: the association versus my name. They were suing me for defamation, breach of contract, and failure to comply with community standards. The list of accusations was long and dramatic, painting me as a reckless homeowner who had maliciously damaged the reputation of a volunteer-led board. They claimed my online posts were filled with lies, that my refusal to pay fines undermined the financial stability of the community, and that my behavior threatened to cause irreparable harm. The damages they sought totaled thousands of dollars, far more than the original $300 fine that had sparked everything. Reading the pages, I felt a wave of cold dread wash over me. This was the move I had feared, dragging me into court, forcing me to burn money, time, and energy to defend myself. It was the classic HOA tactic, weaponizing the legal system to crush opposition. But then I remembered something important. I wasn't alone anymore. The moment I posted about the lawsuit online, the response was overwhelming. Supporters flooded my inbox with encouragement, legal advice, and even offers to contribute to legal fees. A local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes reached out directly, offering to represent me pro bono. He told me I had a strong case, that the lawsuit was nothing more than a strategic lawsuit against public participation, a slap suit designed to silence critics. And in many states, SLAPP suits were not only frowned upon but outright illegal. With him on my side, I felt the weight begin to lift. Together, we prepared our defense, meticulously organizing every piece of evidence I had collected. The vague notices, the retaliatory fines, the smear flyers, the recordings of Max, and the countless supportive statements from neighbors and online followers. My lawyer explained that the HOA's own behavior targeting me with escalating fines and false claims would not only undermine their case, but could also expose them to counterclaims. The first court appearance was surreal. The board members, who once exuded control at neighborhood meetings, looked small and uneasy in the courtroom. Their attorney read through the allegations with an air of forced confidence, but the cracks were obvious. When pressed for proof of Max's excessive barking, they had little more than a handful of vague complaints from one or two neighbors. No recordings, no documentation, just words on paper. Meanwhile, we presented hours of footage showing Max calm and quiet, testimony from neighbors contradicting their claims, and examples of the HOA as harassment. The judge listened intently, eyebrows raising at the sheer pettiness of some of the fines they had issued. By the end of the hearing, it was clear the tide was turning. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Cameras flashed as I explained what was happening, framing the case not as my personal battle but as part of a much larger problem: hoes abusing their power to bully residents. The coverage only grew. Local news stations aired the story that evening, and soon after, national outlets picked it up. What had started as a neighborhood dispute was now a headline: Homeowner fights back against HOA lawsuit over barking dog. The more attention the case received, the worse the HOA looked. Emails leaked from within the board, revealing just how personal their vendetta against me had been. In one message, a board member referred to me as a troublemaker who needs to be taught a lesson. Another complained about the negative PR from my online posts and insisted the lawsuit would shut me up. Those emails became public, and once they did, the association's credibility collapsed. As my lawyer predicted, the case unraveled quickly. The judge dismissed the defamation claim outright, ruling that my posts were factual and protected by free speech. The other claims began to crumble one by one, and the possibility of me filing a counterclaim for harassment suddenly became very real. The board had made their final, desperate move, and it had backfired spectacularly. That night, as Max lay at my feet, while I scrolled through the flood of supportive messages online, I realized the end was finally in sight. The HOA's power over me was slipping away, and not just over me, over everyone they had ever intimidated. Their empire of control was crumbling, and soon the entire community would see it fall. The courtroom was silent when the judge delivered the ruling. The HOA's lawsuit, which they had paraded as their ultimate weapon, was officially dismissed in its entirety. Their accusations had collapsed under scrutiny, their evidence exposed as flimsy at best, and their tactics laid bare as harassment. The judge went further, awarding me legal fees and sternly reminding the association that courts were not tools for silencing residents. It was over. As I stepped out of the courthouse, a crowd of reporters and supporters waited. Their cheers and applause carried me forward. But the true moment of victory came when I returned home. Neighbors, once fearful of speaking against the board, came to my door to congratulate me. Some brought food, others offered hugs, and more than a few admitted they had been waiting years for someone to stand up to the HOA. My victory wasn't just mine, it belonged to everyone who had been silently enduring the same intimidation. The fallout for the board was swift and brutal. The leaked emails had already tarnished their reputation, but the dismissal of their lawsuit destroyed what little credibility they had left. Residents began circulating petitions, demanding resignations. Within weeks, 2 members of the board stepped down, citing personal reasons. The president, who had orchestrated much of the campaign against me, clung to his position at first, but mounting pressure and the threat of legal action from other homeowners forced his resignation soon after. In their place, new leadership emerged. For the first time in years, board elections were contested by neighbors who actually cared about fairness and community, not control. I watched with quiet satisfaction as voices long ignored were finally heard. Policies began to change. The petty fines slowed, the arbitrary rules softened, and the atmosphere of fear that had lingered over the neighborhood for so long began to lift. Max, oblivious to the politics swirling around him, went back to being his usual self. He chased squirrels, barked at the mailman, and sprawled lazily in the grass. Each bark that echoed across the yard now carried a different meaning, not as a supposed nuisance, but as a reminder of the fight we had won. Online, my story continued to spread. It became a cautionary tale for HOAs everywhere, a viral lesson in what happens when petty power trips collide with truth and exposure. Messages poured in from across the country, people thanking me, sharing their own stories, and saying my stand had given them courage to challenge their own associations. What had started as a $300 fine for excessive barking had grown into a nationwide conversation about accountability and abuse of authority. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought back to the moment this all began. The piece of paper taped to my door, demanding money for something my dog had never done. The board had believed they could intimidate me into silence, but instead they had triggered their own downfall. They had underestimated the power of truth, the strength of community, and the reach of the internet. In the end, it wasn't just about winning against the HOA, it was about proving that no one should have to live in fear of petty tyrants hiding behind rules and bylaws. It was about reminding people that even in the face of relentless harassment, one voice, backed by evidence and amplified by others, could bring down an entire system of intimidation. Max barked once, a sharp sound that broke the quiet evening. I smiled, patting his head. That bark, once labeled a violation, had become the sound of freedom. The HOAS reign of fear was over. The community was free to breathe again, and all it took was refusing to back down.